Hi and good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending where you're connecting, if you're in a different time zone, to all of you. And thank you for having joined us today in this Geneva launch of the UN Habitats World Cities Report 2020, organized by the Geneva Cities Hub, together with UN Habitat and with the UN Economic Commission for Europe, UNICE. My name is Daria Cibrario, and I'm the director of the Geneva Cities Hub, which is the platform for cooperation and in international Geneva, which focuses on urban and city issues. And I will have the pleasure of being your moderator for today's session. As you may well know, the report has already been launched last Saturday, which was UN World Cities Day, the 31st of October, and UN Habitat also organized a global launch, and you may have already attended it. So if you haven't downloaded the report yet, you will find a link to do so in the chat box. So please take a look, not now. Since this is a report which is very rich, it counts about 400 pages. And this is also why we've organized this launch, to ensure that some of the key messages that stand out can be picked up a bit more easily, and together with key messages from practitioners and representatives from international organizations, but also civil society organizations and academia and city network representatives, which can resonate their messages with some of the key areas of competences of international Geneva. So I will try to be extremely short, but let me just give a few directions for housekeeping today for the roundtable. So kindly keep your microphone muted, or if you're not a speaker and if you're not speaking at that time, or the IT moderator will mute you. If you can kindly turn your video on if you wish to do so as a panelist, but please make sure you do so when you're speaking. Today's session is unfortunately only in English, so we don't have interpretation available. Time is quite limited, although we have a really interesting list of speakers, but we will strive to have a question and answer session at the end. So if you wish to ask a question, please put the question in the chat, write it down, and let me know if you're directing the question to a specific speaker. And at the end of the session, I will make sure I pick at least a few questions and ask those. Today's session is also being recorded to ensure maximum outreach, and we plan to make some extracts and a brief that will be made available on the Geneva Cities Hub's media. If you have a preference not to be in these extracts or reports, please let us know, contact us, and we will respect your wish. And now, without any further ado, let me just briefly introduce what is the whole concept of this launch. Again, the idea is really to make sure that we build a conversation around this very important report, which doesn't come out very often. The first one was launched in 2016. But what it found at the time has not changed really substantially. And this is one key message that I think we will ask our speakers today to comment on. If in 2016, the report back then already found that cities and urbanization was actually becoming quite unequal, and there was a lot of exclusion and poverty and problems related to an unorderly form of urbanization, what today's report finds is that not much has changed since then. If anything, unfortunately, given the COVID pandemic, there's even more of challenges that cities and urban areas have to face, and we all have to face collectively. Nonetheless, and that is obviously the good news, it is clear that cities and local governments and local communities are really at the forefront of the response to any global crisis, including the public health crisis. And they are coming up with extremely powerful and interesting responses to these, even sometimes under very strict constraints in terms of human resources, finances, and powers. And that shows, and this is one of the key messages of this report, that cities and local governments and communities are at the heart of a sustainable development, and it is unleashing that power, providing an enabling environment to make that power thrive, that we will be able to achieve the SDGs in the next decade of action. Without further ado, I would like then to introduce our first speaker, who is the mayor of Geneva, Mr. Sami Kanan, so a representative of local government. He's also the president of the Geneva Cities Hub. Now, he was really thrilled to be with us, but because of the public health situation, he's had to withdraw his live participation, but he's taken the time to record a message for us. So I will actually let my colleague Tatiana, whom you don't see, but she's behind the scenes managing the technology for us, launch this video. Stay with us. Thank you.
As Mayor of Geneva and President of the Geneva Cities Hub, I am particularly pleased to open today's conversation for the Geneva launch of the UN Habitat World Cities Report 2020, which was released on the 31st of October, UN World Cities Day. I'm glad to see many international Geneva organizations today joining representatives from the UCLG, civil society, and academia at the virtual table. This is well in line with the mission of the Geneva Cities Hub, which aims to facilitate dialogue and exchanges on cities and urban issues within Geneva's international ecosystem, to connect it to the wealth of urban organization of the international municipal movement, including cities and their cities networks and the local Geneva community. By doing so, we wish to support cities and their representative networks as they bring solutions locally to global problems and seek a seat at the table of global policymaking, contributing from our UN city to inclusive multi-level multilateralism. The launch of the World Cities Report 2020 is an important and timely follow-up of what has been a rich urban October in international Geneva, despite the public health challenges we all face. Last 5th of October, the UN Economic Commission for Europe, UNSCE, UN Habitat, and the Geneva Cities Hub partnered in organizing a SDG 11 Day that brought a substantial, yet virtual, participation of city networks to Geneva. Then, on October 6th, I had the pleasure of moderating the first ever UNSCE's Forum of Mayors in Geneva, which gathered 34 urban leaders in an intergovernmental body and launched the Geneva Declaration of Mayors on Cities Resilience. The World Cities Report 2020 highlights how cities, local governments and communities are at the forefront of global crisis, reminds us that they are more than ever central to sustainable development and to the fulfillment of the Sustainable Development Goal SDGs. It also underscores the transformative power that comes from the bottom-up actions of local authorities and communities, as they show the way with local, innovative, often participatory solutions to tackle global problems such as climate change, security, housing, disasters, and pandemics. States continue to play a crucial role, but cannot solve these global problems by themselves. Local governments and their networks are key partners, yet they are not included in multilateral policy making. The preliminary results emerged from the global consultation launched by the UN in January 2020 on the occasion of its 75th anniversary indicate among the top 10 findings that the UN should be more inclusive of cities, local governments and their communities. Through its in-depth analysis and policy recommendations, UN Habitat's World Cities Report 2020 makes a strong contribution reinforcing the call to include cities and their constituencies as a decision and policy-making table. This is no longer an option, but an urgent need in everyone's interest if we are to fulfill the decade of action, fast-forwarding the implementation of the SDGs and to leave no one and no place behind. I wish you a rich and successful conversation and encourage you to continue engaging into dialogue and collaboration around urban and city issues within International Geneva and in cooperation with the Geneva Cities Hub. Thank you very much.
So here we are back. We've just heard from Mayor Scanan, who's really set the stage for today's discussion, reminding us about this mismatch between the fact that cities and local governments and their communities are at the forefront, are the first responders to the crisis, but at the same time do not necessarily have the resources and the voice and the decision-making power at the table. So this is a red thread which we will keep during the whole conversation today and sets nicely the stage. But now let me move to introducing our next speaker, who's also our first live speaker, and that's Dr. Graham Alabaster, who's chief of the UN Habitat Geneva office. So Graham has been supporting the development of urban policies for many years, and so he's really the right person to take us through the key messages and highlights of the report. So Graham, what would you say are these key messages? What is it that stands out of the report that can be used by policymakers, especially in this context of pandemic, as they will have to build these recovery packages and build back better schemes? And what are the challenges and the opportunities for cities and urbanization to unleash their full potential for inclusive, sustainable development? So over to you, Graham, 5 minutes if possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Daria, and good afternoon, good morning, good evening to all of you. Great pleasure to be here, as co-organizer of this event. I'm just going to take a couple of minutes, as Daria said, to run through, for me, what the report, which the main messages from the report. You have to bear in mind that when we started this report, the world was very different, and in early preparations, nobody knew what was going to happen, and little did we know that at the end of this period, this current ongoing period of the pandemic, did we realise the impact it would have on our lives. But I mean, the thing is, I think one message that comes out is that COVID-19 doesn't signify the end of cities. And in fact, I think in many cities around the world, this solidarity of cities and the contributions at the front line of the pandemic has been very, very clear. Really, COVID has been like an X-ray, and that it's shown up in many urban areas, the existing inequities and deficiencies in services, and if you like, magnified the situation even more. So the theme of the report this year on the value of cities is really all about the potential of cities, about how, if we really want to achieve economic prosperity, full environmental benefits and social equity, then we need to unlock these areas by ensuring that cities are better planned, are better governed and better financed. So, I mean, the first real message, Daria, that comes out, you can only get these full economic benefits if the cities run efficiently. So that means providing good levels of service. It provides a governance system in providing an inclusive system where everybody can be involved. The second area relates to the environmental value of cities. Now, there was a lot talked about the issue of density, urban density, and its relation to COVID. And early on, density was seen as one of the main reasons why the transmission of the disease went ahead. But in actual fact, it's not density that we're talking about. It's about overcrowding. And overcrowding, of course, is characteristic in cities where you don't have suitable housing or a suitable place to live, one of our core mandates. So this idea of density and sprawl and compact cities is very, very important, because of course, if cities are planned effectively and they're planned in a compact way without sprawl, the efficiency of service provision is in particular greatly improved. We also find that from the environmental side, that if we look more towards nature-based solutions, which are in tune with the urban environment and the peri-urban areas, we stand to gain a lot from these types of systems. That may be, nature-based wastewater treatment. It may be looking at natural methods of recycling solid wastes. It may be, of course, related to ensuring the city centres are walkable and there aren't many polluting vehicles. But the idea of this efficiency and green efficiency is very important. The third area, of course, that comes out very clearly in this, and I mentioned this already, is the issue of reducing inequity. And, the whole idea that well-planned cities not only provide people with good housing and good services, but they also have green spaces, they also have places for recreation. They have places where the marginalised can feel safe, where security is improved. Because really, ultimately, what we're after is an inclusive city where everyone who has the right to that city can live in a safe, comfortable, healthy environment. And I think the fourth area, which is also very quite often missed in many analytical reports, is the importance of culture and civic pride within cities. We've seen in the pandemic that there's been huge efforts within communities to rally around and to help one another. And to go back to some of the basic values of life that we were taught, many of us were taught as youngsters. So really, I think it's put many of us in a reflective mode to understand how we can capitalize on those social structures. And, we move forward to more inclusive cities. And I think, they say every cloud has a silver lining, and we've learned a lot from the COVID epidemic. But I think perhaps the most important thing is we now have an opportunity to build back some of these systems better. We know that in many cases, although this has been a public health emergency rather than any other things, the ongoing effect of that public health emergency in terms of economic hardship and social deprivation, of course, we're starting to feel already. But it's probably going to get worse over the coming months in many places. So we really have to learn how we're going to rethink some of these systems at the city level. I think my final point as well is that there's a growing reality that many of the world's problems now are best solved by a multi-sectoral approach. My colleagues in the health sector, of course, have known this for a long time. But many of the really most important issues relating to urbanization, such as climate change, for example, need to be dealt with in a multi-sectoral way. This means that traditionally, the core ministry, who we would normally associate with housing or with health or with infrastructure, needs to reach out to other parts of the government. This is all well and good at national government level, but there's still a lot of siloing and a lot of separation between responsibilities. As we move down to the city level, there's much more potential to build on these multi-sectoral approaches. And I think this, in essence, is what we're trying to do. So I'm going to stop there. Thanks very, very much for giving me a few moments to share my thoughts with you, and I look forward to the rest of the discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Graham. I think it was really a very concise yet very effective and thoughtful sum up of the key recommendations that emerged from the long report. And I really liked that you pointed out that COVID is not the end of cities, but quite the contrary. It is actually now the time to invest, if I may say, in sound, smart policies that are going to change bad, if I can call it such, urbanization into good one, and ensure that all levels of governments are involved in this collective effort that we all need to make if we want to bring back the world in a much better place that it was before COVID and now, of course. I would like also to point out at your approach when you mentioned the importance of multidisciplinary approaches and views on policies and solutions for cities. And I think that nicely reflects the wealth of contributions we have today. Each of them more or less represents one of these dimensions that need to work together to make sure that these inclusive, sustainable development potential that cities and local communities and local authorities can unleash can really happen. And with that, I would now bring you towards our next speaker, who is Edgardo Bilski. Edgardo is Director of Research at UCLG, which is United Cities and Local Government. This is the world's largest and most representative city network with over 240,000 members between local governments and municipal national associations. That covers about 70% of the world's population, and it is often referred to as the UN of cities. So Edgardo, I know that the UCLG has contributed directly to the World Cities Report, and there's a specific chapter, which is chapter 7, which highlights the vital contribution that local governments play in unlocking the value of sustainable urbanization. I would like to stress also that there's now a generalized understanding that the role of local and regional governments is key in localizing, that means making happen at the local level, the SDGs. And this is also shown by the fact that there's a real growth in the number of countries which produce national voluntary reviews of the SDGs and involve local and regional governments doing so. As of 2020, there were 55% of the countries which produce these national voluntary reviews, which had involved their local governments in a way or another. But cities and local governments are also increasingly localizing and reporting themselves with local voluntary reviews of the SDGs. And in 2019, there were about 50 of those. I will put in the chat box some interesting documents that the UCLG has produced precisely on the localization of the SDGs. So make sure you check those out. But now I will give the floor to Edgardo. And so Edgardo, what would you say are the key challenges for local authorities when it comes to really unleashing their transformative potential? And what can be done to overcome these challenges? And certainly intergovernmental coordination is one of those. So how do you, as UCLG, see a really good cooperation and dialogue across different levels of government so that local authorities can really unleash their inclusive sustainable development potential? Thank you. I know you have a PowerPoint.
Yes, if it's possible, I will share the screen. Okay, I hope you see the screen, and thank you very much, Daria and the Geneva City Hub, as well as UN Habitat and UNSC, to give us the possibility to share with you today the specific chapter of the World Cities Report that we launched last Saturday, particularly the chapter regarding the contribution of local governments to the value of sustainable urbanization. As you probably all of you know, that local governments are increasing, mobilized, advancing the localization of the global agendas, integrating the SDGs in their policies and development plans, which in turn enhance the value of urbanization. Subnational governments and their networks have not only widely embraced these objectives, but they have also become actively involved in their negotiation and implementation. This takes place in a global framework that have seen during the past 30 years a global progress of decentralization, reinforcing the role of local governments in urban governance. In a majority of countries today, we have implemented decentralization processes that have resulted in locally elected local governments with management authority on public services and territories. On average, as you see on the graph on the left, local governments represent around 25% of general government public spending and revenues, and at least 1/3 of general government public investments. As it was mentioned before, many local governments act today as transformative forces in implementation of the 2030 and the new urban agenda. The chapter I have the pleasure to introduce to you summarizes hundreds of examples of cities from all sizes that are leading this localization movement. Cities are revising their policies and plans, fostering climate change mitigation and adaptation, urban resilience, social inclusion policies, alternative economic models, using new technologies, advancing intermunicipal cooperation, and forging new partnerships between rural, peri-urban, and cities. For instance, for example, more than 10,000 cities from 139 countries made commitments to take measurable climate actions in 2020. Cities were also, as it was mentioned before, in the front lines in the response to the COVID-19, ensuring the continuity of public services, putting in place preventive policies, promoting solidarity to support the more vulnerable. However, the progress is not linear, and setbacks are reported in many countries. Inequalities between and within cities are growing. Metropolitan governance is becoming more complex, and their governance landscape poses daunting problems. Unclear distribution of responsibilities between different levels of government, insufficient devolution of powers, capacities, and resources across all regions are creating a critical mismatch between transferred responsibilities and locally allocated revenues. Globally, decentralization of financing is the dimension with most limited progress. Rapidly growing cities fail to capture the wealth created and struggle with insufficient budgets and infrastructural deficits. Local governments still suffer from limited access to borrowing, especially in developing countries. However, many local governments are becoming experimental hubs to drive the needed coalition of forces to deliver the new urban agenda and realize the added value of sustainable urbanization. Particularly, the resources of planning in policy has been accelerated by the frameworks created by the global agendas. Many cities in all the world are promoting more integrated planning proposals. However, in many countries, particularly in developing ones, cities' capacities and tools to promote adequate planning are still deficient or non-existent. Participatory and right-based approach are being developed and offer a new framework for the co-creation of cities and territories in terms of urban design service delivery. Participation is being expanded as part of the localization efforts for the global agendas. Many local governments are mainstreaming right-based approach into their development strategies to tackle discriminations and support diversity. Particularly, we need to underline the important reference to the right to the city that was included in the new urban agenda. Multi-level governance is also key for policy coherence and collaboration. National urban policies are a critical part of the process of building multi-level governance systems, as recognized in the new urban agenda. In the framework of the SDGs implementation, local governments are making progress in their involvement in national consultation and coordination mechanisms, as mentioned by Daria in the presentation. To move quickly by the conclusions, this rapid review of local government's initiatives, opportunities, and challenges developed in the chapter, offer a promising but also an heterogeneous picture. The global movement of local governments are leading made important progress in the last 5 years. Yes, this progress is still partial and should be reinforced. Therefore, it is urgent to strengthen efforts to galvanize the force of localization of the global agendas in cities and territories, particularly in the framework of the Decade for Action to deliver the SDG 2030 agenda. Then there is a need to ensure an enabling institutional environment for local action. As acknowledged in the new urban agenda, effective decentralization policies can empower local governments to act in a more developmental and sustainable way. Multi-level governance frameworks is one of the pillars of the new urban agenda. Effective multi-level governance is essential to build robust national urban policies that are well articulated with the SDGs at national, but also at international level, giving a place to local governments at the global table for the decision-making process. Special attention should be given to fiscal decentralization and adequate financing flows to support urban investment, as acknowledged by the Addis Ababa Action Agenda. Finally, cities need to foster a culture of participation that involves the co-creation of cities and a right, more specifically, the acknowledgement of the right to the city. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Edgardo. I think in a very short time, you've really elicited a lot of very important concepts that have been, I think, really developed over a very long time. The 100 even more years that the international municipal movement has been in existence, and you've really shared them with us in a bit in a nutshell, but in a very eloquent way. And I would like just to pick up a couple of those before we move to the next speaker and just echo them, because I think they're really at the heart of the challenges of today's urbanization. You talked about the importance of decentralization of power, but also the fact that the resources and the mandates have to be funded. The resources have to follow, and that is definitely not necessarily the case. I also would like to highlight your concept of co-creation of the cities, which is precisely this incentive and invitation to let the inhabitants and the city dwellers to participate, to have a voice when there's urban planning and urban policy development. So that way, there will be a way, a participative and an inclusive way to ensure that cities are more inclusive, but also serve everyone's interest, not only locally, but also at a national level, and scaling up at a global level so that they can contribute to sustainable, inclusive development. And thanks also for reminding us the importance of having local governments at the global table to reach this important and urgent endeavor. And with this second intervention, I will now move to our third live speaker. And after having heard from a city network, we are now diving a bit into specific themes which have already been mentioned during this first part of the seminar, and that are cross-cutting issues that are disseminated all over the World Cities Report 2020. I have therefore the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Mark Ho, who is a technical officer for health security preparedness at the WHO, and so the World Health Organization. And you work in the emergencies program of the WHO. Thank you so much, Dr. Ho, for being with us today, in spite of the very urgent endeavors and heavy endeavors that the WHO is facing today. So if we look at the data from the report, one number which is quite striking is that it is really cities and urban residents that are bearing the brunt of the pandemic. The report finds that 95% of cases are concentrated in cities. And in spite of this huge challenge that we've also heard mismatches often the powers and the resources that cities and local governments have, a lot of cities and local governments are developing a lot of knowledge and experience on how to be effective in fighting the virus and actually containing the pandemic. And it seems that a multidisciplinary, multidimensional approach that Graham was talking about at the beginning seemed to be really a bit key to these approaches. So, Dr. Ho, in your view, what are the key lessons that have been learned so far that you can say by cities and local governments on the ground having to battle with COVID? And what is it as a good practice that can be shared and disseminated to enhance city resilience? What are your recommendations to overcome the challenges that are still there? Please, Dr. Ho, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Daria, and for the great introduction and the presentations that have been made so far. Indeed, we find ourselves in very unusual times and are very busy, not just for WHO, but for many people in this virtual room. It really just reflects the sort of impact that an emergency, a health emergency such as COVID, has beyond health, into so many areas and so many aspects of life. I think one of the first things that we are learning from this is really the important role that cities have in terms of health emergency preparedness and response. And that countries need to start to realize that this happens at all stages of emergency management, from prevention to preparedness to response. And eventually we hope we'll come to a period of time whereby we have to recover and really spend efforts in building back better. And they need to start to then also realize that health emergencies begin in communities, and therefore effective prevention, preparedness, and response also needs to begin locally. And they then need to put their efforts, their investments, and their attention in local governments of cities and these urban settings. Now, cities, of course, have unique considerations, and I won't go into too much detail. We've talked about crowding, the fact that many of them are travel and trade hubs. Many of them also hold hospitals, which support peri-urban and rural areas. In addition, we are seeing, and mentioned earlier as well, this whole idea of inequity in the cities themselves. Vulnerable populations that are suffering more than others because of their situations that they find themselves in, whether they are in informal settlements or relying on informal economies, or they might be migrants, for instance. And this whole idea of taking a whole of society, multi-sectoral approach is really coming to the fore. And we need to think at the city level, what does this mean? For a long time, we have taken preparedness to be a national issue, that national governments take as a national security issue. But increasingly, if we want to do this right, we have to take the actions and the policies and the programs at a more local level. Now, this means that we need to have better governance and better coordination across the levels of governance, vertically and horizontally. So vertically from the national governments down to the city authorities and the local actors, as well as between the local governments and the city authorities. And we need to then see how best to use our resources and empower these authorities to be able to empower their communities in response. And that leads me to my second point, which is this idea of community engagement. And previously Edgardo talked about this participatory approach, and we really cannot emphasize this more, that we really need to have risk communication done well, community engagement, including engaging community leaders and civil society that have been trusted by these communities for a long period of time, as part and parcel of national and global conversations for health emergency preparedness in the future. Thirdly, we need to think about how then do we then involve these other sectors in, in process. In peacetime, there is this sense that it's a health issue, or it's a Ministry of Interior sort of issue, a home affairs issue. But increasingly, we see that because the impact and critical interdependencies are so great, we do need to see how best to bring these sectors in and to utilize the non-traditional resources that we are seeing through COVID. This includes, the other sectors, transport, the tourism, industry, and providing quarantine facilities, for example, in some certain countries and cities. There's so many ways and means that innovation has come up and opportunities that cities have been using to support their preparedness and response effort. They're really making a difference to the control of this protracted emergency. The next point that I have is really on addressing the underlying determinants, and this is really what has been reflected in the report as well, talking about the idea of ensuring that we look after the environment, we pay attention to resolving inequities and attention to vulnerable populations, for instance, are the things that are the nuances that are important for us to bring forward in the future. And lastly, this whole idea of building better for the future. Sustainable urbanization is essential. And Graham talked about this idea of the culture and civic pride coming in. And we are seeing that increasingly the cities themselves would be the center of this idea of building and recovering to become more resilient in the future. This will not be our last emergency. Recently we had a United Nations side event, which Mayor Kanan was also talking about how we need to build better. We need to learn from this. We need to build together as a local, national, and global community to ensure that we are resilient and that we are better prepared for the future. And this will only happen if we are willing to break the silos and work together with community participation for the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ho. I found it personally extremely inspiring what you say, and it gives us also hope at a time which is certainly a difficult one for everyone. But I would just like to emphasize how you come back from the standpoint of the WHO, so of public health, to the points that have already been mentioned by other speakers before, like the key issue of governance. And thank you for highlighting how intergovernmental coordination and multidisciplinarity can be vertical and horizontal, and we need both of those. And then you've touched on the importance of participation and co-creation, because involving the community is going to be key for the resilience of our future cities, communities, but also countries. And the investment today, the investment must be at the local level if it has to kind of trickle up in terms of strength and resilience to future crises. So, and the determinants of health, again, thank you so much for these important reminders, and the fact that everyone in this room, as you said, is really involved in a way or another from their area of expertise and perspective. And this is why we're going to a next topic, which is also a really hot one in the context of what we are all experiencing and living today. And it is the one of housing. Access to adequate and affordable housing is a human right, but it is not being upheld well. The data here are striking. If you look at the report and other data from other reports as well, you will find that 1.6 billion people worldwide lack adequate housing. That's 20% of the world's population. And that 1 billion lives in slums and informal settlements, whereas 150 million are homeless and millions more suffer from insecurity of tenure. So one thing that the former special rapporteur on the right to housing, Leilani Farah, mentioned during the first lockdown time in March was, but if lockdown is the key measure that is called upon by national governments, how can this really work to stop contagion if we are in this situation? And so cities and some governments are, of course, taking action, calling on a change, a radical change to ensure that this fundamental human right is upheld. And the UN, of course, are also working on all of that. However, there's still a lot to do, and there are also some different approaches, because communities and inhabitants themselves are also self-empowering and building cities from the bottom up. They're trying to find concrete solutions to fulfill these basic human rights that can no longer wait more than ever during COVID. This is why we've asked Béa Varnaï, who is a project officer at Urbamonde, to tell us more. Béa Urbamonde, correct me if I'm wrong, is an NGO based both in Geneva, so Switzerland, and Marseille, France, which empowers vulnerable inhabitants and public actors. It provides technical support to implement collaborative housing and participative urban development, also helping to carry out neighborhood improvements projects in many countries. So Béa, from your perspective as Urbamonde and from the perspective of your constituency, so vulnerable inhabitants and city dwellers, what are the community-based solutions that are viable for the global housing crisis? Of course, it's not just this which is going to crack it, but what is it that works? And what solutions are needed from government, cities, the UN, and other multilateral organizations? I know you have a PowerPoint. Please go ahead. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Daria, and thanks for having us on this conversation today. So actually, when we speak, well, today we also speak on behalf of not only Urbamonde, that you presented very well, and thanks for that, but also a number of grassroots and civil society organizations, academic institutions, and other allies that work in the field of community-led housing or participatory urban planning and the urban fabric, and we call this network Cohabitat. So yeah, we're glad to be joining this conversation and to bringing in some of our views and also examples from the field, so to say. So maybe just before talking about some of those examples of community-led housing solutions, it's also worth saying a few words on this global housing crisis, as you very well introduced, Daria, and also the World Cities Report draws on it. The crisis is truly global in a sense that it affects all countries, all contexts. And it's indeed a crisis because it really threatens the livelihoods and the living conditions of not only low-income communities, you mentioned, people living without access to adequate housing in slums, but also I think increasingly, and we can all speak to this, I think the housing crisis really also affects the middle-income households, having more and more difficulties in accessing adequate, affordable housing options. So it's also worth saying a few words on, the underlying causes of this crisis. And you mentioned Leilani Farha, who also has done a very important and striking work in actually depicting or showcasing some of the underlying causes of this crisis, which is a financialization and commodification of housing. Or put in other words, the fact that we don't see housing as a human right, or we don't see it for its social value, but we actually see it as an asset to be traded on financial markets and something that we can make profit with. And actually, this financialization is today not only one of the drivers of our urban economies, but also one of the probably most detrimental forces that are at play and that had effects on urban populations. So here you can see one quite extreme example of the effects of financialization resulting into mass evictions in Lagos last year and the beginning of this year. But what is important to say and what we believe is that actually to break this vicious cycle of unequal urban development, social exclusion, and financialization, we need disruptive practices. And and that these practices need to be rooted in the needs of local communities, and they need to be driven by them. So in another, maybe two, these disruptive practices already exist and they can be supported and they can be expanded. So I'm just gonna draw on a few examples of how we can get there, or how people manage to get there. So my first example will be about community land trusts, which you may know are rooted in the movement for social rights in the United States, and which are organizations that hold land in a trust and are democratically controlled organizations that they will hold land and extract it from property markets or urban land markets. And in this way ensure the permanent access to affordable housing, but also social services, amenities for communities. So one very interesting example for this is the Caño Martín Peña CLT, which is in Puerto Rico, because it actually draws on a legal framework for CLTs that exists in the US, but will adapt it to a local context, which is set in, informal settlements. And this is really an example that gives a lot of hope also for, let's say, the potential of expanding these kind of non-speculative land tenure models, not only in the global north, but also actually in different settings in the global south. A second example that I would want to bring to the table today is the Ban Makong, or Affordable Housing Program of the Thai government, which is very interesting, not only for its scale, but also because it really is rooted in and based on community practices such as community savings that can be of informal character. And actually the state or the CODI agency, which is a governmental agency, will invest in these community savings mechanisms. It will also provide infrastructure and housing subsidies and affordable housing loans that are then managed by organized communities. And it will also facilitate technical assistance for these communities for participatory planning and for the upgrading of informal settlements. So this is a very, I think, very widely shared example as well of how community-led housing can be, a true co-production between state actors or institutional actors and communities. Our journey will now take us to Uruguay. So in Uruguay, there's actually a long tradition, more than 50 years of experience of the cooperative housing sector, which has developed a mutual aid and collective ownership model for the access to housing, which will also decommodify housing by extracting it from the market, because the cooperative will collectively own those housing units. And actually, Uruguay has embraced this model as really as a solution or a response to the challenges of housing low-income and middle-income families in the country, and put in place a number of institutional mechanisms, financial mechanisms that enable cooperatives to thrive. So we will, have as examples, a land bank at the level of the city, which is put in place and reserves land for the cooperatives, but also public housing subsidies and affordable housing loans that are made accessible and available to the cooperatives, as well as, again, facilitated access to technical assistance for the cooperatives. So today we have more than 627 cooperatives in Uruguay that house people. And as a last example, and I will conclude here, I would like to take you to Geneva, since we're at least virtually in Geneva today. So in Geneva, there is a very recent cooperative neighborhood development that is called Les Vergers, Eco-Quartier Les Vergers, which houses 3,000 people today. But beyond housing, it also develops commercial spaces that are based on cooperative and circular economy and different types of sustainable innovations, eco standards, and so on. It's really a project that is stewarded by the municipality of Meran, but also a grouping of housing cooperatives of Geneva. And again, here as well, the project is really rooted in a number of mechanisms and institutional tools that are being used that allow the cooperative housing sector in Switzerland to be relatively successful when compared to other countries. So we have municipal land leases. We also have facilitated access to affordable housing finance because the state is actually providing public guarantees to the loans. But also the National Federation of Housing Cooperatives, or federations at different levels, have developed their own financial tools to support startup initiatives. So this was just a very short overview of a few examples that are known to us, that are promoted by different communities and organizations. And we do believe that through the right instruments at different levels, we can really scale these experiences and make them a more meaningful tool in terms of securing the right to housing.
Well, thank you, Bea. Thank you for having taken us through a journey around the world, looking at how communities are actually finding, either by themselves or in cooperation with the public sector, ways to uphold and secure this basic need, which is housing. And thanks also for having reminded that the global housing crisis is really a global one, which affects very dramatically low-income countries. As you rightly said, there are countries where there are forced evictions because of the commodification of housing, but also middle-income countries and also cities like Geneva, which is usually seen as a rich, as a wealthy city, but yet the right to housing can be very elusive here too. And thanks for all these inspiring examples which give us hope. I would invite you to put in the chat perhaps some of the resources from Urbamonde, some reports, so that our attendees and speakers can also get familiar with a local but glocal at the same time organization. Thanks very much. And by the way, we will circulate the presentations and you will find them on our website if the speakers agree with that. So you will be able to get them back. Let me just also remind our attendees that if they wish to ask specific questions to any of the panelists or a general question to the panel, please write it in the general chat and we will seek to bring those questions up with the panel at the end of the session. But now I will move to the next speaker, who also is going to bring in another big piece of the jigsaw of world's cities today. And that is the very important issue of migration, forced displacement, refugees, and how these population movements impact on urbanization patterns and on cities. We have seen from the report that 1 in every 7 people on the planet is actually a migrant, and that most migrants are found in urban areas. There's almost 1 billion migrants worldwide today. That's the estimate. So cities are also on the front line of irregular migration, with refugees, internally displaced people, and often have to set up refugee camps or don't have enough resources to provide the basic services to give first help and enable people to live in decent way as they arrive into a different country or they move to a different area. And these challenges are even exacerbated in a context of a global pandemic. So we're extremely pleased to welcome Cécile Riaillan. I hope I pronounce it correctly. Excuse me otherwise. You're head of migration and sustainable development at the IOM, the International Organization for Migration. And thanks for being with us today. And we're going to ask Cécile to briefly take us through this complex subject in relation with cities. So, Cécile, what is the current situation for most migrants, refugees, or internally displaced people moving to cities? And how are local authorities dealing with the provision of essential public services to migrants? What do they need to be supported in doing so? And finally, how has COVID impacted this already complex and difficult situation? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Daria, and good afternoon from my side to all the speakers and participants to this important discussion. Indeed, along the lines of what you said, I think, and what previous speakers have said, COVID-19 is certainly, public health emergency and crisis. It is a socio-economic crisis, but it is also, to a large extent, a human mobility crisis. And let me just say a few words, indeed, about how the pandemic has affected migration flows around the world and how does it translate in terms of the situation in cities. So we can really see that the pandemic has had an unprecedented impact on migration, human mobility, and displacement in general. And to date, we have about 98,000 travel restrictions that have been enacted in over 219 countries and territories, and we're still counting. And of course, as we're going through the second wave of the pandemic in most countries around the world, this is really a situation that is constantly evolving. So as a result, large numbers of international migrants are stranded across borders. They are unable to return to their countries of origin if they want to, or they are, not able to really work as they used to in the countries where they found themselves. And we can see as well that asylum systems in a number of countries around the world have been put to naught at a critical time. So, international protection also is being seriously affected by COVID-19. So also overall, what we can see is that the impact of the pandemic on migratory movements has been very asymmetric, and we can see a very diverse situation. For example, in Greece, arrivals are on the decline, but along the central Mediterranean route, they are 4 times as high as what we saw in 2019. In Venezuela, to travel to another part of the world, people are both returning and leaving the country. In Central America, there's a new caravan of about 4,000 people that are traveling towards the US as we speak. And all these movements of back and forth across borders, unfortunately, really means that smugglers are winning double. So this is really the situation that we can see. So we need definitely a coordinated response that requires really an in-depth conversation about the future of mobility and how borders can be open with health safety measures, and how does all of that translate into cities. I've been talking a lot about the international migration situation. Let me also say a few words about internal migration, and that is of direct impact as well on the situation in cities, because what we have seen is that a number of countries that the internal migration has meant that a lot of people have, fled from cities back to, their places of origin, and quite often, in fact, those places of origin are in rural areas in an attempt to, continue to have access to a livelihood. And again, as the situation is still evolving, we have to see how those internal migration flows will evolve. But we can really see that all of that has majorly impacted cities because we know that half of international migrants reside in 10 highly urbanized, high-income countries. So that's the reality. 80% of the world internally displaced people and 60% of all refugees worldwide live in cities. So also, and it has been said very eloquently before me, we can see that, with 90% of all reported COVID-19 cases, urban areas have become really the epicenter of the pandemic. So what happens in cities in terms of connecting the pandemic, the response and migration is of critical importance for us in IOM. So what we can see is that indeed migrants in urban settings often find themselves in precarious, informal living and working conditions. And in some cases, migrants have been discriminated against, excluded from access to rights that are absolutely critical for effectively combating the pandemic, including access to information, testing, healthcare, education, housing, as it was discussed before. food, and so on. So migrants have been really particularly vulnerable to stigma and xenophobia, and we have seen that in some parts of the world, they've been really the scapegoats and, you know, literally labeled as responsible for spreading COVID-19. Yet local authorities really recognize the opportunities that migration and migrants bring to the host community, and they do understand the needs and problem areas. And most of all, they have a direct interest in finding solutions that work for the entire community. And several cities around the world have therefore really, fully understood that migrant communities are part of the response for mitigating the impacts of the pandemic on local economies and societies. Indeed, the pandemic has clearly demonstrated that migrants and refugees are important community members who directly contribute with their skills and resources. With an estimated 164 million migrant workers, yet we are really seeing that migrants directly contribute to essential services in cities such as healthcare, food production, construction, transport, services in general, and agri-food processing. So migrants and refugees are leaders who really can mobilize as well their communities in responding to the virus, and they are key contributors to also designing and implementing recovery plans. So we can really say that in many cities around the world, migrants and refugees are acknowledged heroes of the response to COVID-19. So we really need, and this is where I'm going to have messages very much in line with what we've heard from my colleague from WHO and others about the need to really connect the dots and really look at this in a cross-cutting manner. And thinking at two things, both indeed the horizontal policy coherence and the vertical policy coherence. Both really matter if we are to really bring the issue of human mobility in COVID-19 response in meaningful manners. So what we're looking at is really that, you know, those cities and communities that have an inclusive approach to COVID-19 response and recovery have greater chances of bouncing back faster and building back better. I think this is really a critical message. So from a human mobility perspective, that means really integrating migration into COVID-19 urban planning and recovery processes. In addition, cities can play a vital role in mitigating xenophobia, discrimination, which has been on the rise, as I've explained. So this means for cities to really also turn not only to the sustainable development goals, as we've heard, because indeed human mobility is a very important part of what we need to achieve, well-governed migration if we want to reach the sustainable development goals. But we also have the Global Compact on migration, which is also a very important instrument itself rooted in the 2030 agenda. So we really have to see, you know, how cities can play a very important role in implementing also the Global Compact on migration, because in there you have, through its objectives and, you know, cross-cutting elements, a lot of the responses that we actually need to recover better, you know, really looking at human mobility as a way to do that in effective manners, given the role of migrants in our societies, and particularly, as I said, in urban economies and urban societies. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Cécile. And again, I'm really amazed at how each of our speakers managed to pack in terms of content, but also policy recommendation in such a short time. I will not go very long, but I just want to re-emphasize what you said at the beginning as a key. The COVID is actually also a global mobility crisis, and I like to put the accent also on one of your last concepts, which is that inclusion, including migrants and refugees, is a key aspect of ensuring resilience to our cities and societies and countries overall. So thank you for these very strong messages, and we will capture the takeaways of your contributions in the forthcoming briefs. I will now move to the next topic, which takes us to the next speaker, and that is social cohesion, social inclusion, and also work. And that is another critical part of the discussion around cities. And in the World Cities Report, there's again quite a few telling data and a whole couple of chapters which deal with these issues. But let me just elicit a few before I give the floor to Edmundo, whom I will introduce in a moment. So 2/3 of the world's urban population is facing a worse income inequality since 1980. This means today that 2.9 billion people are living in cities where income inequalities are now worse than they were a generation ago. So unfortunately, we're not going in the right direction. So clearly, there's something which is not working. And I also recall pretty striking data from one of the last ILO social protection reports that said that about 70% of people on Earth, unfortunately, have either insufficient or no social protection. So at a time of COVID, this is a real disaster in the sense that as people lose their jobs, many of those people are in the informal sector, there's no social security net which is there to catch them in a way or another. This is what takes me to welcome Edmundo Werner. Edmundo, welcome. You're now Associate Professor at the School of Built Environment and Architecture at London South Bank University. But we know, and many of us have worked with Edmundo in the past, you're a former urban focal point for the ILO and the International Labour Organization. So welcome, Edmundo. Can you tell us a bit in a nutshell, having looked at the findings of the report, what are the root causes of these expanding urban inequalities, and what can cities, local governments, but also national governments and the UN and other stakeholders do to ensure a better social cohesion? And how can local governments also have a role in generating decent employment opportunities and therefore fueling a virtuous cycle of local economic development, which is inclusive? Thank you. The floor is yours, Edmundo.
Thank you, Daria. Good afternoon, morning or evening, depending on where you are. Thanks again for the opportunity to address this important event and to be able to meet again colleagues with whom I have been together in the urban frontline and also to meet new ones. Social inclusiveness is fundamental for urban sustainability. This is well noted in the World Cities Report. But there is something that should be left behind and to be excluded, as Daria mentioned it already, that is poverty. There has been, and rightly so, a great deal of attention on the right to the city, on the importance of people from all walks of life sharing the city. This should definitely be the case for differences in terms of gender, race, religion, place of origin, cultural background, sexual orientation, age, and other differences. But in terms of income, there is no point in praising diversity. And it may be utopic to think about everybody having the same level of income, but it is dystopic to continue towards increasing inequalities with all the impacts noted in the World Cities Report. So initial investment to create enterprise and jobs is fundamental to generate surpluses and consequent tax revenues to finance public expenditures. This will help break the present cycle of lack of public funds for infrastructure and lack of financial contributions from enterprises and workers. Creation of income and employment should not be a by default consequence of economic growth. There are ways to go beyond and by design. While cities require substantial improvements in infrastructure to promote the economy, its very implementation can generate much needed employment. Labor-intensive techniques should be promoted. In many cases, they do run capital-intensive techniques in terms of costs and quality, and at the same time create extra employment. Hiring local workforce means that the salaries will enter the local economy with multiplier effects. Pro-employment policies should also support groups with specific needs. One of them is young people struggling to enter the labor market and women who often have less access to opportunities than men. Combating COVID can also generate income. The hygienic upgrade of workplaces will enable enterprise to be back in business, and the provision of such services will create jobs. There are some projects already, some initiatives that are going into this direction. For the local economy in general, each city should carefully assess its comparative advantages, identify the local value chains that can generate more income and employment, and invest on them. And let aside the ideas of a panacea. Sometimes tourism is being thought that it will solve all the local problems. Maybe in some municipalities, yes, but not in all of them. And sometimes also you see local governments or mayors in particular wishing to attract a large multinational factory to the town or the city. This will create thousands of jobs and massive revenues, which it's understandable, this idea. But while there are thousands or hundreds of thousands of municipalities, there are only few and far between factories, so it's not a solution for everybody. So the solutions need to be more endogenous. Also, the transition from informal to formal practices may be less complicated than one thinks if there is political will. For example, a street vendor who is registered with the local authority is already towards formality. This can be done, as it already been done in many cases, if there is will. The World City Report mentions the need for appropriate macroeconomic policies. This is correct, yet needs complementarity. There is much that can be done at the local level, bottom up, like the examples given. Citizens are at the same time users of cities, as has been stressed by previous speakers, but at the same time they are producers of urban space. So the two dimensions need to be brought together. It is at the local level that urban planning and socioeconomic policies meet each other, with great opportunity for synergy between sustainable development goals, such as number 8 about the economy and decent work, and number 11 about human settlements, to mention only two. Therefore, let's take ownership of this opportunity. Thank you. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Edmundo. I find very eloquent examples that you have provided, and again, you have identified the virtuous cycle between employment, the investment in employment generation, and the return of that employment whenever you have a sound system of taxation, including municipal fiscal systems that can indeed enhance the resilience and the capacity of cities to provide infrastructure and services. So thank you so much. I want to dwell because we are slightly running out of time. I invite our attendees and panelists to stay perhaps an extra 10 minutes if they can, so that we will surely have some time for questions. But again, thank you for this really important contribution, Edmundo. And now we move to yet another dimension of of the urban life, of urbanization, and of cities that has already been mentioned on several occasions during this roundtable, and it is the environment and the importance that greening cities, but doing that in or finding nature-based solution in a smart way, how important that is to enhance the resilience, not only to climate change, but to any kind of crisis, including the pandemic. And so I'm particularly pleased to have Dr. Alexander Hejazi here with us. He is senior lecturer from the University of Geneva at the Institute of Environmental Sciences. So Alexander, you're also many other things, which I won't say, but among those, you're also in charge of part of the international relations of the university. So welcome, welcome. And I will just go right into the heart of the matter. So you're also an expert on data, by the way, and how data and urban can come together for the good. And you've been working a lot also with our colleagues and partners from UNESE. So how can we enhance urban resilience to face better in the future an increasing threat, which is coming obviously from climate change, pandemics, and other disasters and emergency? And how can we do that through nature-based solutions? And how can data and science help us in doing that? Also, do you see a way to protect our commons, environmental commons, be them water, air, biodiversity, and can cities and local governments play a role in there? The floor is yours. Thank you, Alexander.
Thank you very much, Daria, for to provide us with this opportunity, not only to reflect on the very valuable report of UN Habitat, but also to discuss between us and also launch the conversation to see how to better take stock of some of the experiences the cities are going through. Obviously, the most the closest to us is the COVID situation, the pandemic that we are going through, but also some of the success stories, but less successful stories when it comes to bringing in nature in the city. And this is at the heart of what I would like to share with you from coming from the experience of few years of greening the cities and some of the practices that have been scaled up across the planet in the cities to developing more sort of targeted nature-based solutions that address new sets of uncertainties and risks. I want to, if okay with you, to share a few slides with you to illustrate what I would like to emphasize on. If I can get the, apologies for the delay, I need to find, here it is. Do you see the PowerPoint? Okay, so very quickly, in taking stock of where we are coming from, obviously localizing is becoming more and more important. Localizing these global dynamics that have been we've been talking about, and other speakers and panelists been mentioning. So contexts do matter. Mostly, and I would say, I would like to highlight this because of the higher frequency of shifts and changes that we are dealing. These shifts and changes deal with the environmental issues, climatic change. Climate change is obviously at the heart of a lot of deployed tools, but also demographic and socioeconomic factors within the city. So communities are increasingly are pressured, and therefore there is a need to develop the resilience of the communities beyond the built and natural environment, or beyond the capacity of natural environment to enable the sustainability agenda of the city. We need to bring back the communities to some of these policies because of this higher frequency of the shifts and challenges. Adaptation to climate change and extreme weather events, as well as the mitigating of negative effects in the urban environment, are major concerns for all cities. So is the addressing increasing inequalities that were mentioned previously in the cities and the specialization of those inequalities within the cities. So we need to take stock of these crises, but also some of the new crises such as COVID, as I was saying earlier on, to better prepare for the next ones. Obviously, this is in addition to some of the practices of urbanization across the planet in terms of land use, transport, and other issues related to planning that are posing severe health threats through increased water, air, and noise pollution. Car-centric approach to city planning is still very valid and used across the planet. And this is something that just one example that really forces us to think creatively about new tools of planning. And then there is another element that I wanted to mention within this localization need of global dynamics. The need to better understand the integration of socioeconomic and demographic realities within some of the policies that have been, or strategies that have been implemented, be it from the environmental point of view and or other elements that are related to city policies. So taking stock of all that, but also from the greening of our cities, the experience of greening of our cities, I would like to share with you a few points that I think are important. You know, greening policies have been around for many years, with obvious increasing number of benefits and ecosystemic services for individuals, but also communities. They have high potential, as we all know, and the science has informed us, to reduce impacts of climate change, such as the heat island phenomenon. This is one example, but many others. And offer high health quality urban areas. They have boosted the quality of our landscapes, our urban forests and countrysides, our neighborhood and our streets. And the use of indigenous species in some of these greening projects allow cities, distinct species of flora and fauna to find habitat, food reproduce, and concretize the qualitative objectives carried, and in this case in the canton of Geneva, here in Geneva, but across many cities. So there's a lot of good things when it comes to some of these greening experimentation, greening the cities experimentation. But then we are in a new world, as we all know, and some of us mentioned, and obviously it's highlighted also in the report. We are in the COVID and pandemic situation. So what are the lessons learned? What we can understand is some of the very successful greening methods have hard time developing or producing the results that are needed in a crisis mode or in a crisis environment that cities are facing. Traditional environmental protection measures are compromises between costly projects and unquantifiable results, and the outcomes are uncertain. The current practice of planning new development or retrofitting existing ones, like the one that is illustrated on this slide, failed to address a variety of cross-sectoral interactions. And I emphasize on what was discussed and mentioned before. There is cross-sectorality and transversality and multiple interactions that exist among the technical, natural, and socioeconomical fields. And the policies and the models that we had previously have a hard time yielding results when it comes to that element. So instead of protecting nature, the innovative paradigm of what I would like to bring here is the blue, green, gray approach to nature in the city that could protect the urban population, create more livable conditions, and enhance the urban metabolism while enabling the community to face new sets of risks. Instituting also something that is mentioned in the report, and I think that there is a lot of value in this blue, green, gray holistic approach to cities, is to develop further the culture of stewardship, protection, and promotion of natural environment. And as such, we can target or the scenarios that are win-win both for the natural environment, the built environment, but obviously also for the communities. So this brings me to the core of this discussion that I would like to share with you, is that by conceptualizing the city and its infrastructure, including with the urban water system, but also the vegetation as a living system or ecosystem, it helps us to transform the existing divide between cities and the environment into an integrated approach of nature-based blue-green solutions. And then what is important also is to rethink of urban cycles. One element is water, but obviously it's not the only one, but also the materials and energy embedding nature-based solutions into a city's infrastructure and introduce innovative master planning strategies. By reshaping the built environment, nature-based solution, I believe, can enhance the inclusivity, equitability and livability of cities, regenerate deprived districts, improve mental and physical health and quality of life for the citizens, and reduce urban violence and decrease social tensions. And this brings me to my last slide, that how do we go to there? And this is something that I maybe should have just had this slide for you, Daria, because I know time is short. We need to take a little bit of distance from and understand the limitation of technocentric models to city planning, and development must become inclusive of people and community based on new deliberation tools and methods. And I really highlight this and want to focus on this deliberation word, because that is where we bring in community into the equation. We need to carefully bring the human element in data-based approach to policy. Knowledge co-production, as we mentioned previously, should be based on more granular data in complement of national data, which is available to us, and develop better flow on information. And I conclude on this: better flow of information and return on experiences between science and policy to understand the multiple trade-offs while optimizing the co-benefits. And this is how I believe we can, and answer to your question, Daria, we can pave the way to protect our commons. If there is no continuous exchange and knowledge building between scientific community and policy formulation, will not be able to move ahead with this protection of commons in not only in crisis mode, but also after the crisis, when the resources need to be prioritized. Thank you very much, and apologies for my lengthy presentation.
Thank you, Alexander. It was a really rich presentation, and we will share it, because I think we have to go back, certainly myself, to learn more about this dimension of urbanization. But if I have to put it in a nutshell, I just want to remind what you told me during the ODD, the SDG 11 day on the 5th of October, and that makes a nice transition then to Gulnara, who's our next and last but not least speaker. You told me for many centuries we've tried as humans to separate nature apart from the urban areas, but now it's time to bring them back together and to make sure that they can live together in harmony. So I just want to remind to the whole audience this concept, which I think exemplifies in a way, partially, what you just said. And this really takes me to then give the floor to Gulnara Roll. So Gulnara, who is secretary to the Committee on Urban Development, Housing and Land Management at the UN Economic Commission for Europe, and partner to this roundtable today. It is a really nice conclusion to today's roundtable, and precisely because the Urban October that has just concluded last week has been very rich, as Mayor Kanan has said in his video. And that's precisely what takes me to directly ask the question to Gulnara about the Geneva Declaration of Mayors. I still have here the card which was distributed on that occasion. I was lucky enough to be part of this. The Geneva Declaration of Mayors, which was launched on the 6th, and it is about resilience. So Gulnara, can you tell us a bit more about what is it? How does it work? What is the purpose? And how does it nicely actually resonate with the recommendations of the World Cities Report 2020? Thank you, Gulnara. Please go ahead.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you very much, Daria. It is really great to see you and to see all the colleagues in our urban networks. I'm very happy to see Edmundo, who is now with a new at the new assignment. So congratulations, Edmundo. Yes, I think it's very important to speak about Geneva Declaration of Mayors. This is a very important document which was discussed at the first Forum of Mayors, which was held on 6th of October this year, indeed at the very beginning of the Urban October and during the UN Sustainable Cities Week. And this forum brought 40 mayors and vice mayors from 36 countries from the UNEC region, which is Europe, Northern America, Central Asia, and Caucasus, where the mayors and vice mayors shared their experiences to address key challenges of this time. And we see that this exchange was very much appreciated because there were so many of the unique experiences that cities were facing at this time. And this is why the theme of the forum was actually updated to become City Action for a Resilient Future, strengthening local government preparedness and response to emergencies and the impact of disasters and climate change. So we looked at the Forum of Mayors at COVID, at how the cities are acting during the COVID-19 pandemic situation, but also a bit wider, because as we were preparing the forum, we saw that in some of the countries, COVID-19 pandemic situation was actually in a way colliding with other disasters. For instance, Zagreb was facing the earthquake at the same time. The same was in Tirana. So definitely this, what already discussed today at this event, the approach of multi-hazard and multi-stakeholder was in the center of this forum. And definitely this is something to, which is very important, definitely, for the future development, development of this forum as well. So the forum was opened by Olga Algayerova, who is the UNEC's Executive Secretary, Mrs. Tatiana Volovaya, Director General of United Nations in Geneva, Giuseppe Sala, Mayor of Milan, Italy, provided a keynote address, and there was a special address, a message to mayors by Lord Norman Foster, an urbanist and architect, who actually set the tone to the Forum of Mayors and to discussion of the declaration, basically saying that the pandemic indeed has accelerated pre-existing urban trends related to digitalization, transport, urban green, public spaces, and he also proposed to look at it as really positive as an opportunity for the future development. Having here many of our very good colleagues and partners, I would like to thank the Geneva City Hub also for hosting this meeting, but also for the very important support in the organization of the Forum of Mayors, also UN Habitat, because there were quite a number of organizations who were partners to this event, who helped to actually convene this forum. So that was very important, and I think that definitely becomes to be a very important tradition of our cooperation here in Geneva. So what is the Geneva Declaration of Mayors? So this is a document which mayors who attended online and in person the Forum of Mayors endorsed by acclamation. Declaration is a very ambitious document, and it's aimed to place SDGs at the center of the local government's recovery efforts and create new urban realities for the benefit of all. This is very important. I think this is something what many of the colleagues today spoke about, taking this integrated approach, looking into the social, economic, environmental aspect in a very comprehensive way, but also working together between the local government, national governments, and all the stakeholders at the city level. This, as a declaration, is a very much forward-looking document, because declaration underlines that the pandemic provided a testing ground for what cities could look like. The pandemic demonstrated that transformation of urban spaces can happen really very quickly. And if there is only one lesson learned from the crisis, it is that rapid change of urban reality is possible. And therefore, also the change of the behavior is also possible. I think this is a very powerful message, which is in this declaration. So it means that when we're working together in a concerted manner, we actually are able to make these positive changes very, very quickly. So the mayors also stress in the declaration that they want to use the current momentum to rebuild the cities, the way that all people can thrive, that quality of life is the guiding principles. The nature and biodiversity are an integral part of urban planning. Sustainable economies generate wealth for all, and there is a solidarity among city dwellers, and we overcome the inequalities. So declaration also aligns the city leaders' efforts with the initiative of the UN Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres, to build back better and turn the COVID-19 recovery into real opportunity for shaping healthy future. So, and you see on the slide, the structure of the Geneva Declaration. So indeed, this is not just a text. And I mean, from what I read, you hear that it really has a lot of very strong messages. And the mayors who attended the Forum of Mayors, they really took it as a blueprint for their actions. And for us, what is also important that Geneva Declaration and the Forum of Mayors is not just one-time event and not just one document. So we have created, now established an online portal where we're collecting best practices, and we definitely would like to use it as a vehicle for the future exchange, for documenting the experiences, and also for discussing how more efficiently we could be working together. From today's discussion, I think what I would like to stress that the Uninhabited report on the world cities is a very comprehensive document. It's very important to communicate it to the city levels. And I think the value of the Forum of Mayors that we organized together with you is that we actually created a platform where we brought together the local governments and national governments and other stakeholders. And this is something which will stay, and we will definitely bring us together also in the future years. Thank you, Daria, back to you.
Thank you, Gulnara. That was absolutely eloquent and very complete. Just so that you know, I've also shared the online version of the text of the declaration with all the attendees. And again, sorry that we ran up a bit out of time. My moderation skills are not as strict as I sometimes think, but I think it was an extremely interesting conversation for all of us. There are a couple of questions that have come up, but I am afraid it's going to be a bit hard to address them unless I'm looking at, there's a question for Graham and a question for Cécile. Would you feel like giving a 30-second or a 1-minute answer to any of these? Are you able to stay for an extra 5 minutes? Yeah. So Graham, there's a, yep.
So sorry, just from my side, unfortunately, I cannot. And just to mention that I've replied already in the chat. So hopefully the answer is already provided. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So Cécile, thank you very much. Please, of course, feel free to leave and we will be reaching out to you because of the excellent presentation. So thank you very much. At least let's keep the principle and let's have one question for Graham. The question is, how does COVID affect the new urban agenda premise about density and compact cities? How could this concept be stated if we knew what was coming? Is this a good way of approaching compactness of cities? This is a question from Buenos Aires, from Alvaro Arguello. Would you feel like
yes, although thanks very much.
A quick answer. Yeah.
Question. Yeah, I mean, you know, we know that, you know, preventing urban sprawl is very important for compact, well-functioning cities. I mean, for a lot of reasons, but because, you know, a good example is the cost of infrastructure increases very much when cities sprawl and they become poorly planned. But also, you know, you've got much better opportunities for different types of non-motorized transport, these things in cities. But the main issue in relation, I think that the question, Alvaro, your question is about, is everyone thought that, you know, with these densities of population that we experience in many of the megacities and increasingly in some of the smaller urban centres, that this was going to be result in much greater rates of transmission of diseases like COVID-19. But the issue is not so much about density, it's about overcrowding. And overcrowding is, of course, about, you know, housing and providing people with the correct standard of housing that's well constructed. But it's also about the provision of open space, giving space with the city for people to exercise. So yes, density is important from the point of functioning of a compact city and making the city more efficient from a variety of reasons. But the key critical thing, particularly in relation to transmission of diseases, is overcrowding. And I mean, it's not just the case for things like COVID, it's many other diseases. So I won't go into more detail there, but you know, that's basically what our interpretation is. Thanks.
Thank you, Graham, for answering in a very concise and yet rich way. So I would like to say thanks to all our panelists, but also to all our attendees. We had at some point over 70 participants. That's a really good score given the Zoom and webinar overdoses we are all facing. So thank you very much for that. Let me just say thanks beyond our panelists to Stephanie Luz, who is also from UN Habitat, and she's been helping us with the organization of the panel. Thanks also to Tatiana, our colleague here at the Geneva Cities Hub, who has been the IT moderator behind the scenes. Thank you so much. And of course, thanks to our official partners for this activity, UN Habitat and UNESE, here represented by Gulnara. Thank you very much. I think some of the key messages are really the same. And I think as practitioners in urban, in international Geneva, connecting to local governments and city networks of the world to make sure that urban issues are well made visible and worked through in our areas of competence here. I think that the issue of governance has come out loud and clear, the issue of multidisciplinary approaches, and this is, it's nice that this is reflected in today's seminar. And with the World Cities Report 2020, we do have a set of powerful policy recommendations and examples which add to other tools that have been exemplified, including the Geneva Declaration of Mayors, but also all the wealth of tools and intelligence and knowledge and initiatives that cities and city networks such as the UCLG and the Global Task Force for Local and Regional Governments have developed and continue to push forward, including with the UN. So I really would like to echo once again what Mayor Kanan said at the end of his message, which was, let's continue to work together and cross-fertilize and see how we can cooperate in a transversal way, starting from our UN city, Geneva, and connecting it organically with the international municipal movement, as well as with the wealth of local governments and cities around the world to win the big bet and gamble and for inclusive, sustainable urbanization in city, as the clock is really ticking and the COVID is giving us a very strong reason to act if we hadn't had enough good reasons before. With that, I really thank you once again warmly, and we will reach out to you with the outcomes and a few products that we will develop from this webinar. It's been a pleasure and an honor to be your moderator, and keep in touch. Thanks to everyone. Keep well. Be safe.
Thank you.